The first question that I almost always ask is, hey, if I could sneak into your board meeting, what do you think is the number one priority or challenge they're working on for the next 6 months to a year? There's a really good chance they never shared what they're about to share with anyone before.
Product market fit. It's something that every company struggles with, from one-person businesses to the Fortune 500. How do you create the most compelling products and services that customers can't wait to buy? In this podcast, you'll learn the exact discovery questions, phrases, and techniques to help you get customers for life. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the morebusiness.com podcast. I'm your host, Raj Kara, and I am joined by a very exciting person today, Bob London. Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I hope I can be exciting today.
Well, you are exciting. Bob and I happen to live in the same geographical area just outside of Washington, D.C., and we've known each other for, I don't know, must be 20 years or so. Bob, let's go into your history. You were a chief marketing officer. You were then an on-demand chief marketing officer, right? You work with tech
Correct.
companies for the most part, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. How did you become a CMO first? And then we'll talk about the rest of the journey.
Talk about accidental. So I started back in the old days in the advertising business and with a regional agency in where I'm from, which was Baltimore. And I ended up getting a job with a company that probably needs a little bit of explanation because it was something in the telecommunications business. There used to be something called long distance, which used to be there were
Right.
probably billions of advertising dollars spent between AT&T and the company I was with, which was called MCI, which is no longer operates under that name, and Sprint, which is still kind of around. Um, but I joke about that. But when I speak with audiences or teams, I don't, if I bring it up, I explain that you used to have to pay to make calls, between one city and another, one state and another. And,
Yeah.
and those calls were billed separately from your local calls and other calls. And now it's like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So at MCI, it was kind of my first big responsibility where I ran advertising for the consumer division. So without really knowing much about what I was actually doing, I freely admit that at the time I didn't, but now I do, that I had a $200 million budget for network TV and such, and was managing a big New York agency with a lot of help, obviously. And from there, I went on to some other kind of communications and leadership roles, not senior leadership at MCI, but it was a very successful company for those. It was, it was one of the original, just sort of upstart companies for those who don't recall that AT&T was monopoly, and we actually broke down their monopoly through regulatory channels, and then we're able to take, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in market share from AT&T every quarter by out hustling them and undercutting their pricing and stuff and things like that. But anyway, so very successful company, and there were a lot of interesting opportunities. It was a young, work hard, play hard type culture, which I think a lot of people can relate to. And
I remember, Bob, I remember one of
please,
the best campaigns I've ever seen, I think, on TV. It was a great ad. And you're right. Back then, you had to pay for phone calls. And if you were a kid and you're trying to dial home, you always called collect. You always had mom
yeah,
and dad pay, right? So you'd go and you'd call collect. And MCI came out with this beautiful campaign all over the news. It was 1-800-collect. And they
that's
didn't
right,
say who the company was because they found that if they said it's by MCI, people would be afraid, oh, I don't have MCI. I can't use
right.
this. So they just said it doesn't, they didn't even mention it. It was just 1-800-collect, so easy to remember. And suddenly they gained so much market share from a sleeping giant, AT&T. And,
Yeah.
they tried to scramble and they came up with something called 1-800-CALL-ATT or something, but it just didn't have the same cachet.
Well,
I was like, that was a
AT&T,
genius marketing campaign. So
it was. I was not involved in it. People who were involved in it were so smart, and as you pointed out, they were smart enough to recognize not everything has to tie back to the master brand. But just a quick funny. So I was involved in this happened. 1-800-collect came around as I think I was getting ready to leave MCI, but I did get approached by a Hollywood studio who said, we're looking, do you want to do product placement? And so there was a movie coming out called Speed with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, and it turned out to be a huge hit. And they said, well, why don't you send us one of your 1-800-collect bus signs? and or make
Yeah.
one up, and we'll put it on the bus, and then you'll get all this exposure. So it turned
Yeah.
out that it was not in the movie, but when you look carefully at the trailer for the movie, and you can still see it out there, that 1-800-COLLECT is on the bus, a bus for about 5 seconds, and then the bus explodes. And so it's in the trailers. It's
Okay.
not one of my
Uh,
finer moments, but anyway,
uh,
MCI was. I will say this for it's instructive, I think, for people in business. MCI was a risk taking company that the reason we were successful was the pricing being cheaper, but also because we recognized we had a big dinosaur, AT&T at the time, who had no customer centric DNA, no sense of marketing,
mhm.
no real taste, as Steve Jobs would say, in terms of what was going on in the market, and we just beat them at every turn, and it was such a great learning opportunity for me and a proving ground for many people who went on to some fantastic things. So, um, the link between that job, that experience, and being a chief marketing officer was not that clever or sophisticated or calculated. Um, I actually left MCI. I was burned out, and I started consulting and just out of a house that I had just purchased in Washington D.C. And after a year and a half, one of my clients said, "We're about to let go of our VP of marketing, and we'd like to talk to you about the job." And I was about to get married and take on real responsibility, and so I said, "Yeah, let's talk about it." And it was during the big internet run up before the dot-com bubble, so that would be almost 20 years ago. And I took the leap and became a VP of marketing. So I'm not sure that if there had been a lot of scrutiny on my background and a rigorous, interview process, they knew me as a consultant. They were pretty happy with the work, apparently. So that gave me the VP of marketing title, which then made me feel like, ooh, I'm a real marketing guy, not just an advertising guy and a communications guy. And I think looking back, that was an illusion, because the question I've never asked myself the question: Do I want to be in marketing? Do I want to commit to learning how to be a marketer, not just a communications or advertising person? And but it was financially, it was very rewarding, this opportunity. But I think that's where I lost most of my hair, actually. So because it was not only was it a stressful environment, but it was not a fit for me. But I kept showing up and trying to do the job and leading people. And this is part of the journey of learning, being honest with yourself about what you're great at and what you're not great at. And so it was painful. And then I stayed in marketing though, and ended up being chief marketing officer of a very short-lived startup that ended around the time the dot-com bubble burst. And it was
Mm.
a B2C e-commerce, received venture money like everyone else, and it just didn't go anywhere. And then not long after that, I went out on my own and became a fractional chief marketing officer, as you pointed out, working with 3 to 5 tech companies in the DC area mostly at a given time, and trying to help them with marketing strategy and also some operations. And so I wasn't a chief marketing officer for that long, but it did teach me that um, what it takes to be in that job. And I
Yeah,
would say that
yeah.
maybe not in the moment, but later I learned that this wasn't me. I mean, it just wasn't a fit for
It
me.
it's a really good point that, you're a consultant, then you go into corporate, money's great, but there's something that's either sucking out of your soul or it's just not a fit because, I don't know, like you enjoy being the independent consultant. And I know that there's a lot of temptation by consultants when they do a fantastic job at companies that the companies will think, okay, well, let me hire them because they're going to be great at the job. And they don't do a great job
Right.
because they're actually better as a consultant than they are as a direct report to a CEO or something like that. And I've seen that
Right.
happen. And so that's a good point that you bring up. So now you're chief listening officer, and I really love this discussion about customers because in today's market, here we are, we're in a recession, whether the government's admitting it or not. We are in I mean, like people are struggling uh, to close sales. I do see reports that some companies are still turning it up. They're just growing and growing, but that's not the majority. That's a lot of people who maybe they just have an amazing product market fit, which we can get to because talking to customers is how you get there. But the other ones are struggling to even maintain renewals, and it's a hard year for a lot of reps, and it's going to be probably for some time. So you've found a way that just by talking to customers in a certain way that you actually can learn so much more. And I think a lot of people think, oh, I listen to my customers. When they're unhappy, I fix the problem. But that's not
Right.
really what listening to customers is. That's just, you're kind of handling the phones for customer support a little bit, but it goes so much deeper. Could you share how you define listening to customers?
Yeah. So, you really, you kind of nailed it. I mean, I think that just going back to one quick point about the economy, I would argue no matter what the economy, but right now, you know, uh, companies have to do a better job of understanding their customers, understanding with a capital U. In other words, understand their big picture challenges and priorities that are driving what your product or solution needs to accomplish for them. And I do a lot of work with customer success teams, which is very widespread in the SaaS software as a service world. And I think there's a tendency to have these quarterly business reviews that are all about features and functionality and milestones when
Mhm.
the listening piece in those meetings, in customer meetings, should really be about two things. One is, first, we have to ask customers much better, more curious, thoughtful questions. I call them disruptive questions, and I'm happy to give you a couple examples. And then we just have to shut up. Like, I'm not kidding you. Like,
Yeah.
we have to just shut up and listen and see where the customer wants to take the conversation. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
there are the ecosystem of training for sales and thought leaders and speakers. Most of that is, I would say, 90% of it is geared towards talking and pitching and how to, create winning pitches. And it's not that it's not important, but there is not enough of a canon of thought and work around how to understand other people. There's some of it. I don't think it's transcended into the B2B customer facing world very much, which is what I'm trying to influence. So it's the
Yeah.
disruptive questions,
Yeah.
get them to open up by asking better questions, and then just stay back, like lean back, almost like close your eyes and try to imagine what they're saying and what the impact is to these. They're human beings, right? They're not just companies, they're people, and understand what kind of pressure are they under? What are the expectations that are set of them? And don't just take their answer and move to the next question. Just sort of, I think it's like a metal detector. When you find something interesting, start digging a little bit with a second level question. And that's the stuff that's the work I do. And I fall in love with that type of work. I've done 2,600 customer discovery conversations for my clients. And now I teach customer facing teams, how to do discovery, not just in the context of we have a new prospect and we have to do discovery where it's a checkbox, but more like it's a continuous process to understand your customers because their needs change all the time. Like, I don't know
Their
why
needs
we don't
change.
understand that.
Yeah.
Customers
And
change.
and oftentimes, like when you get into a company, maybe one division needs one version of your product or something like that, but the opportunity for expansion can be massive and really grow your business just by selling inside a customer. And the way you do that
100%.
is not just asking for a referral in another department. That's like very a sales oriented approach, but a very customer driven approach would be to dive deep. So I'd love to know, what are some of these questions when you talk to a customer of a client? What do you say?
Yeah.
How do you open up the conversation, first of all? And then what do you start asking?
Oh, that's a great question. Good question. So when I start these conversations, I always, so this is, my client's customer might be a director of finance, because my client is selling some sort of financial management platform, as a service. So
Mm,
I will, and they've gotten an email. I ghostwrite it. My client sends it out and says, "Hey, we're trying to raise our game in terms of how well we understand our marketplace, and we brought in a third party, and he just has a few questions. Do you have 30 minutes to talk about your business? We're not going to pepper you. It's not a customer satisfaction thing." But when they get on the phone with me, this director of finance, let's say, the first thing I say is, "Do you have any questions, or did you want me to give you a little bit of context?" And as you might guess, 95% of the people say, "I would love a little more context." Why? Because they're busy and they don't remember every email that they got and every meeting that they signed up for. They don't know me. They know my client, but they really, and it's an opportunity for me to set their expectation that I'm not going to ask you about sort of features and benefits and user experience. I'm going to ask you about your world. And
mm,
they're usually very pleased to hear that. And because truth is, that's what they're experts in. So they're very open to talking about that kind of stuff.
It's a
The
lot
first
easier for them
question
to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and
Yeah.
we wonder
Yeah.
why they don't engage when we ask them to come to a quarterly business review, which is invariably it's about us, the vendor.
Yeah. Right.
And it's because we're gonna kinda drag them through a bunch of slides, etcetera. And so, the first question that I almost always ask is, "Hey, if I could sneak into your board meeting, what do you think is the number one priority or challenge they're working on for the next 6 months to a year?" Now, they don't have to have been in the board meeting to answer that question. I'm asking, what do you think the board is talking about? So this
Mhm.
accomplishes two really important things by asking at the beginning of the conversation. The first thing it accomplishes is you're going to understand, you'll get a sense of what's going on at the highest levels of the company, and where the budget is flowing. You know, whatever they need to get done in the next 6 to 12 months strategically, there's a chance that you can tie your solution to that, your product or service, and position your product and service as, hey, well, that's good to hear that's a priority because we actually help with that, right? And they can agree or not, and then you can pursue the dialogue. But the other thing it does is it disarms the customer. What do I mean by that? Even after I give them context at the beginning of the call, they're still expecting to be a typical vendor call or a typical research call. And by asking the question about the board, it wakes up a different part of their brain and they kind of go, "Oh, okay." And a lot of times they'll say, "No one's ever asked me that before. That's a good question."
Mm.
Or it's an interesting question. And that's great because if they've never been asked that before, there's a really good chance they've never shared what they're about to share with anyone before because no one's asked that kind of question. So that's a good, like, if you're a baseball person, like a leadoff batter, that's a good first question
Mhm.
to ask. Um, doesn't have to be a board meeting. You could say, if I could sneak into your senior leadership meeting, you can
Mhm.
probe a little bit. But I get
Yeah.
great, substantive, helpful answers to that question. And the teams that I coach and teach all give me the same feedback that, you know, um, it's an unbelievably useful question to set a different tone for the call.
The thing I
Does that
love
make
about
sense?
that question, it makes a lot of sense, and what I love about it is that you're understanding the client's ecosystem and how, and you can report back to your client, like, well, this is how the product fits into that ecosystem, and I
Exactly.
think that's one of the biggest things that's always missing. And I remember when I I've run a few companies, and the way we figured out what products to build out was to understand what that customer is doing throughout the day, not just what do they want to do the last time they logged into our product. It
Right.
was actually, "Well, what are you trying to do today? What's the priority this week? What do you have to get done this month?" And then you see how you fit in, and when you see how you fit in, wow, that is so eye-opening. Because sometimes you're just this tiny little sliver can be replaced in an instant with some other product that's faster, cheaper, looks better. Whereas, boy, we use you all the time together this day, whether we're logging in or not, we're still using stuff that comes out of your software or whatever your product is. That's that's where you wanna be, right? And you can use this
Yeah.
information for product market fit. Do you have an example of someone who
100%.
actually used some insights from this type of question
Yeah.
to create a type of
Yeah.
product market
Well, I
fit?
have a number of them. So there are, I'll call it two categories of insights. There's the more sort of a little more tactical where, oh, the customer said this. And so I can help that customer solve a problem by using our product. Then there's the more strategic bucket where, well, if they said that, that's not great news for us, or that could be very good news for us, because it means that they actually need things that we have on the roadmap. For example, there was a company, a good success story in our area, in the Washington D.C. area in Virginia, called Park My Cloud, and they were acquired by a I don't know, like a 70 or $80 million cloud services company, which was then acquired by IBM not long ago. So it was a good success story. But Park My Cloud, I'll just tell you briefly, before I started working with them, this was several years ago, they had a very broad cloud management platform, and it help you governance and orchestrate a lot of the buzzwords. Um, but it had some interesting features that were kind of buried in there. When I went to talk to their prospects, because they couldn't get any customers at the time. They couldn't set they had pilot customers, which weren't paying. or beta. I don't remember what they called it. And I interviewed a number of them with this sort of open-ended approach. And I asked the questions that I typically ask, some of them, and they basically said, we're not going to buy this ever, probably, because
Mm,
it's so early in in the evolution of the cloud. This was when AWS was becoming big, but the other cloud players hadn't really emerged as much. And so we don't have any idea what our requirements are today, and we probably aren't going to know what they look like in a year. So how could we buy such a full featured wide platform with all these
mm,
features without knowing exactly what, and you're telling us what the cloud's going to look like in the future. We don't know that. So I and this is one thing that's great about not, talking to people rather than a survey. So I then, that's not great news, but at least we know. And I said, is there anything in the platform that you've seen that seems useful? And they said, yeah, there's this one feature that it's like a schedule for turning instances on and off automatically when they're not being used, cloud instances. And I said, oh yeah, yeah, I've heard about that. And I said, well, so, but if you like that feature, why didn't you buy the platform? And they said, because the feature is just one tiny piece of this full thing that we don't need. And
mm.
they said, can I buy just that feature? I said, no, I don't think so. And they said, well, that's ridiculous. Like, that's something interesting to us. So bringing all that back to the founder of the board, the decision was made to scrap the entire platform, but keep some of the infrastructure to launch this one feature as a very specific point solution, called Park My Cloud, which basically you're parking it in the driveway when you're not using it.
Mm,
And I can get into the problems that it solved, but it was called Cloud Sprawl, where everyone was spinning up AWS instances all over the place, and they would go
mhm.
unused, and then people would forget to turn them off, which cost money. So
Right, yeah.
I was not the main player in this. There was a product team that was, I thought, brilliant. The board and the CEO were I thought they took a big risk to keep the company going and pivot. And they went to an AWS trade show called reInvent. And it's like they were getting engagement and deals from very, very large companies who said, this is exactly the problem we have. So
Hmm.
it's like a turnaround rescue story. That has a lot
That's
to
a
do with
great story,
leadership.
though. That's
Well,
a great
yeah,
story because, we think like as founders, as business owners, our ideas are fantastic. Oh my gosh, I mean, you and I have run across so many people who are just married to their idea, won't budge. But the moment you start talking to people like, well, I use that, I don't use this. I like this part of it, but I don't like that part of it. You really gain that understanding and you can understand how to pivot your product and that maybe people don't need that whole enchilada. They just want salsa today. And that's it,
yeah.
you know?
I think
So,
to your point earlier, I think the CEO, his name is Jay Chappell, um, deserves a lot of credit at a time when they had raised money, had not brought in a single customer, paying customer, to meet me. We met, and I actually coached him in a pitch competition that I volunteer for with Tian Wong and
mm,
our friend Tian Wong, and for him to believe that it was worth spending a decent amount of money to have me come in and have a more agendaless, open-ended conversation to understand what was going on and why they weren't selling anything. I thought that was
mm.
I'll call it I didn't think it was a risk, but for him, it must have been, a tough call. Like, we don't have the money, but it's
Mhm.
important. We got to figure this out. So I give him a lot of credit in that.
That's really important to manage your team that way, and I really like what you shared. I've shared this story a number of times, with people I've spoken to. I think I might have shared it in one of my earlier podcasts, that one of the best lessons I've ever learned about building products to get product market fit was from a former vice president at Harley Davidson, and he
Mm,
would allow people to ride the motorcycle, come back, and then he would say, "What would you change to make you wanna buy it?" And then he said exactly what you said. They would close their mouth, they would let the customer talk. And then the customer would say, "Well, I like this. I would want the handlebars higher. I'd want this." And what that allowed them to do was create upgrades actually for people to
mm,
say, "Oh, well, we've got a way to do that." And you could do, and then the next thing you know, the cost of the cycle is actually a little bit higher. But nevertheless, that just that openness and willingness to listen to what
yeah.
customers actually want changed their company. It helped them go from almost, I think they were about to go bankrupt, and they just turned it around. And it's obviously one of the biggest success stories. Um, so that's a
Can I
great
make one
example,
can I
Bob.
make one point there? So you
Yeah.
said before, and I agree, a lot of companies say, "Oh, we listen to our customers." The best companies understand their customers. If you have to do a certain type of listening or data gathering to understand them, then you have to recognize when that's important. I would say that any successful company that we can identify, I don't care what industry, B2B, B2C, any successful organization understands its customers. Sometimes they have to do a different kind of listening to get that understanding. Then you have people who say, oh, well, Steve Jobs said he would never listen to a customer. Okay, well, Steve Jobs made himself the prototypical Apple customer and said, what would I want? And so that's like one in a million. So if someone says that, I'll say, well, with all due respect, are you Steve Jobs? Like
I know.
we can make this
I
a
hear the
quick
same
meeting if you
thing.
are, because you won't need me.
I hear you. One of the challenges that I think some companies face also is that they'll look at other people that are competitors in their space and all that they're able to accomplish and the
Oh
feature
my
sets
God,
that they've
so
got,
true.
right? And it's like big company envy, and so they try to mimic that. And I think to your point is, you're not Amazon, you're not some of these large companies, but if you've got that little tiny feature that is just so well designed that people are like, oh, that's a no brainer, and it's priced right. That's
Right.
really what can help capitalize your business pretty fast. Um, Okay, so you've got questions that you ask. Give me one or two other questions that
Yeah.
you ask customers to really understand what drives them.
Sure. Well, I'll give you one that's a little farther down the stack and is more appropriate for account managers or customer success. And that question is, um, and I always ask it in this way, it's kind of conversational. Well, let me ask you this. If you got a call or an email from one of our competitors tomorrow, how would you react on a scale of 1 to 5? A one is you pretty much ignore or delete the message. A five is you pretty quickly get back to them and find out what they've got going on. Now, we're trained to not ask those kind of questions. Like, why would we mention competition? We don't want to give them any awareness or oxygen. But the beauty of that
Mhm.
question is people don't end up answering and talking about your competitor. It's a way to get them to talk about you. And what I mean by that is they'll say, well, I'd say a five, meaning I'd get back to that competitor. Oh, well, thanks for being so candid. Can I ask what would prompt you to get back to them? Well, we're not looking around, but you never know when you're going to learn something new, best practices or a feature that they have or something. So, we're not leaving, to switch or anything, um, but it's a source of information for ideas. And plus we like to be courteous. So from there, what I often ask is, well, just hypothetically, is there something you're not looking, but is there anything that a competitor might say in their outreach that would really get your attention? Like something that may be missing or something that you hadn't thought of. And that's where the gold mine opens up because you're getting your customer to talk about their wish list, basically. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, well, if it was cheaper, I'd have to listen to it because our CFO says, but putting that aside, there's a lot of substance that comes from saying, well, what is there anything a competitor might say or do that would really cause you to get serious about looking at them? And that's where they start talking about what would the perfect relationship look like? What are they missing? So a lot of these are, I call them delta, the different delta questions, the difference between what they have today and what they would like. And another one of those is, what would make you a customer for life with us? And of course, it's not a literal question. It's sort of more of a figurative, hypothetical. But they start thinking about, and sometimes they think out loud, and you can hear them thinking, which is also fascinating about. Well, I think if we had this feature that we've been asking for a long time, we probably would be set for 5 years, 10 years.
Wow.
So they really open up about the
Wow.
difference between yeah, so I've got a bunch of those questions. If
Yeah.
if people are interested, they can hit
Yeah.
me up on LinkedIn. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and it really gets the customer's brain going in a different direction is what I've found. That's
Mm.
why they open up.
Yeah. And I think it's really like it's good to get that feedback. Now, one thing that I know is risky is listening to one or two customers and building out features. Because what
Yeah,
ends up happening is that you risk becoming a custom consulting company for that one customer. which if you're trying to scale a business, that's harder to do, right? You can't
Right.
just like continue to iterate your product. So how many times do you have to hear the same type of theme in customer feature requests or satisfaction, dissatisfaction to actually tune your product, change your product? What have you seen as the trigger?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and it's an important. There is no one answer. I would say this, and I go back to Amazon and the way they created Amazon Prime. That there was a ton of data saying that it was a good idea, and here's how the financials would work. And there was data that said no one else is doing this. Why should we do it? And customers aren't asking for it. That kind of thing. At the end of the day, they have to make a judgment call. Jeff Bezos and his leadership, they have to, okay, they have to look at both sides or all sides. And then it's a human decision. So it's the same here. Let's say there's a product leader or founder and they're getting feedback from these open-ended discovery conversations, sales and existing customers, account management or customer success, but they're also looking at product usage data. They're also looking at competitors. They're also looking at survey data, NPS, and things like that. And it's when all those things come together and are clearly saying, hey, if we just do one or two things differently, then or add one feature, then there's a decision to be made of should we or shouldn't we, and what's the investment in that versus investing it in some other part of the brand or customer journey. So I don't have. I would say that usually for what I do, which is tends to be in the brand strategy, positioning, messaging, value prop area, and that's why I'm doing these customer listening tours. 10 to 15 conversations. If they all start to sound the same, then you can confidently make a recommendation and justify this positioning in the marketplace or value prop or brand strategy. For product, it's a little different. You need more scale. You need more scale in the feedback, and you need probably some data and a more of a competitive sort of landscape view of it. So I don't have a number for that, but I would say if you talk to 10 or 15 customers that are representative and they all are saying they have the same need, then that's an easy thing to say, okay, well, let's just validate that with a survey, or let's do a pilot program, or let's, put something out in beta or
Mhm.
something.
So I think we're both agreed that it's not you hear somebody say something like one or two people say it, and then you go and change your products. That's insufficient data. You do need a little bit of statistical
Oh
validity
yeah.
to make sure that you're hearing the
One of
same thing from people.
one of my previous clients had said, he must have said it 10 times in the period of a couple of years, that a, a data point is 1 point, two data points is a line that could be an arrow. So you're kind of putting it that way.
Yeah, yeah. Bob, what inspires you?
That's a really good question. I think that I'm continually inspired by finding new ways to get people to understand the value of listening and understanding each other. And what I'm learning is so I defined it as asking your customers and prospects certain questions, but it is a much bigger challenge in society, in civil society. And it's a bigger opportunity, not necessarily for me, but, I think the realization that from feedback I get and just thinking about it is imagine if just 1% more people in the world listened to each other instead of kind of just sat in their corners and disagreed, or 2% more, what would the world be like? And I think that I'm not saying they should listen and agree with each other. I'm saying they should listen with the intent to understand the other person's point of view. And I think that it's not just me, but many people feel like, the internet and particularly social media has made it too easy to scream at each other without being face to face. Like there's people say so many things that they would never say in person to another human
Mhm,
being. I don't care if it's
mhm,
Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or nextdoor.com, which is one of the biggest culprits, where neighbors all of a sudden have these very strong points of view about speed bumps and they start criticizing each other personally, and
mm,
it really is a shame. So I would, what inspires me is the idea that, that there are so many ways that listening can help. And I would also say this, that I get very inspired by my kids, by the stuff they're doing. And I'm not sure I don't think it's because I have low expectations. I think it's just fascinating to me to see them evolve and grow as into adults and start taking on responsibilities and all the stuff that people do. So there just seems like, every week or so there's some, and it's not because they're like doing extreme sports and winning Olympic medal. It's just basic stuff. But for them, these are accomplishments, and I just like seeing that. I guess part of what I'm saying is, as a parent, it's nice to see things work out, because for so many years, at least the way my brain works is, filled with anxiety that it's not going to work out for my kids or something like that. So maybe it's not inspiration, but relief.
I think many of us can relate to that one. So, hey, I appreciate that sentiment that that you learn a lot more when you listen than when you're talking. And so I think that you're right. That applies not just to the customer journey; it applies to every part of life. And I think we'd be a much more happier society if we just listened more and listened to other people to understand their point of view. Um, could you share maybe one or two of your favorite books?
Yes. Well, it's interesting because they don't seem to fit into the typical categories of books. Um, I'll call them startup books, but it's not tech startups. One of them is the oral history of Saturday Night Live. So from the founding, from the idea that Lorne Michaels had, and he had to get funding. It's just like a startup story. He had to get funding, meaning a commitment from NBC, and then all the hiring problems he had and the talent problems he has. Unbelievable book about the history of Saturday Night Live. And then when I read that, I found a few others that were very similar. There's one called, I think it's called "These Guys Have All the Fun." It's an oral history of ESPN, which started,
Hmm.
as many people know, as a little independent, crappy station running a bunch of program no one really wanted, to this global behemoth. And it's a great story. And there are a couple others like that, that I just really love hearing the backstory, but in an atypical way. Again, ESPN, they had to raise money, they had to build infrastructure, they had to hire talent, they had, the evolution is the same as a startup, and the lessons are very similar in terms of it's B2C. So it's not so much understanding what your customers need to make their lives better. It's more like it's harder. It's in B2C, it's sort of guessing what will turn what will turn the audience on, what will engage them. And that's just a lot more subjective, but became very good at that. So those are two good ones.
Very good. Thanks, Bob. How
Sure.
can our listeners reach you? You said LinkedIn. So
Oh,
do we just type in Bob London and go to LinkedIn?
yes. Or vice versa. Go to LinkedIn and type in Bob London.
Ah,
My
great.
website,
Of course.
if
Yeah.
people want to learn about the work that I do. So I publish almost everything I do on LinkedIn. So it's, you can follow me or connect, and
Mhm.
see what I talk about. And I try not to publish just platitudes and quotes, famous quotes. It's more like, here's how to do this, here's how to do that. It's a little more instructive. The website where I kind of operate is Strategic Customer Convos, CONVOS.com. And that's a good place to follow what I'm up to these days, and engage.
Very nice. And I love your and you're very open. He shares on LinkedIn all the time. I follow Bob. I have been for a long time and I learn everything. Every time I see one of his posts, I learn something new. So I appreciate that. Bob, thanks for being out there and listening to people. And thank you for sharing your insights.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for having me, and also for doing this as a service to the audience. What you're building here, this community and this platform, and these kinds of conversations, I hope are helpful to people, because I've been watching, and they've been very helpful to me. So I hope I've, contributed in some small way to that. Thank you for having me.
Thank thank you very much.